Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Grant Ongers about top 10 lists and the new product security capabilities framework from OWASP. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand, and we've got one announcement. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSA24 and use the code 54USecWeekly. It's on the site. You'll find it. Go check it out. You'll see it at the site, and we'll hope to see you there. And that's my stumbling way of trying to segue into another week of news. And it's always funny to me that last week we had tons and tons of articles. This week didn't feel like it had as many interesting and fun articles to read through. But Qualys, however, their research group, they're always doing fun things. There's somebody at Qualys Research who just loves picking apart old school Linux, Unix capabilities. And this is Glibc or Glibc, however you wish to pronounce it. But both in syslog and qsort. And I think kind of my meta commentary is that it's a wonderful article. The article I linked to goes into some high-level details about just what do you need to know, how bad is this. They're not overselling it in any way. And then they put their marketing, which is expected, near the end, as well as some links to some more technical details. But I think, that's how I wanted to kind of introduce this. I know, John, you were already looking at some of the technical details. Let's have you maybe introduce a bit more of this.
Sure. So yeah, the nerds at Qualys, as I refer to them. Hi guys. This is it's interesting what they're doing here. So I posted 2 links as well. I think there are probably 1 or 2 links down from the one you clicked on. If you go down to details, you'll eventually get there. But the thought process and the methodology behind what they're doing here is sort of interesting. So I'm thinking particularly right now so there's one in vsyslog, which is a heap buffer overflow. So in theory, you could, based off the size of your message, which you're trying to syslog, get a code execution. Their comment is the chance of actually executing on that is, I forget the actual code, but it's very difficult. The second one is in qsort. And again, this is interesting, but to me, the part is not so much the vulnerability itself. I mean, these write-ups are really good. Like, this isn't just us ex-Qualys people saying this. Like, anyone out in the industry reading these things are like, these guys are doing a damn good job. But what's interesting about it, I'm back on that word again, is they sort of how they went and picked through what function they wanted to try and play and see if they could actually find a vulnerability in it. And then they include their test code of how they're going through and looking to see, let's set up some pointers, like get a copy of them. Let's go run some sorts, then see if the pointers are still equal at the end or if our canaries have been damaged. So it's really fun to sort of go and see how do you test to find a vulnerability like this in some code that you're sort of looking at sideways. And you're like, that looks like there might be something in there. How do you prove or disprove that? And then further on, I think I also have a link in my ones for people really interested in this. So this got posted out to the open source security mailing list. And Solar Designer hopped on and took their test example and went a little bit further. And they start looking into the source code of where this patch got brought in, where the vulnerability got brought into the source tree. And the thing is, it's a good example to think about, Mike and Akira, from, I complain from my days when I would do, code reviews and stuff like that. You want that patch to be not something big and massive and crazy, but tight enough so it understands what you're doing. But if you look at it later, you can understand what someone else is doing. And one of their comments is, it's a little difficult to figure out what completely was going on in this patch. It's just big enough that you're like, what was actually changing here? It's not massive. It's probably 100, 150 lines. But still, the picture around of what happened here, and what distributions are vulnerable. They know it's in CentOS and ROX OS. It's not sure if it's in Arch, but it's sort of, they're still going and looking and figuring out how far this is spread.
Yeah, and on that note about when did this happen? Even in the write-up, they were saying that this was the local provesk in vsyslog was inadvertently introduced, as they say, in August 2022. and backported to version 2.36 when it was trying to address a different, less severe vuln. So that does speak to your point about, what does the patch fix? How clear is it? And it's just one of those interesting things that we've seen in the past, different examples where a security patch didn't fully patch the vulnerability. But this is one of those kind of cases where the security patch introduced another vulnerability. So it's one of those things that's really tough. And I would love to know even a little bit more about how they found this, because John was just describing, where they look in the code, things like that. But it seems like it's very human driven. So it's the folks over in that research unit spending their time and not, there's some tool assisted, but it's not being so successful that they can just unleash a fuzzer or some other, SaaS tools, et cetera, finding these vulns in very recognizable syslog and qsort. Those are not obscure, areas of code.
I want to talk a little bit about a meta topic that this article brought up for me. When people come to ASW, they're either AppSec professionals, they're CISOs, they're product security people, they're developers. But being the resident noob, we also have quite a few people that are new to this field. And a big question I get from people is, where do I go in security? What do I do? And I want to talk about the process of what a security researcher would be looking at when going into a vulnerability like this, so that people can maybe get a little flavor of what is it like to be a security researcher. And I want to hear y'all's opinion on that.
That's going to be a long answer. So part of the first way to start that is just to figure out, what do you want to specialize in too? Because there is definitely a difference between Windows exploit development, the Windows, playing around with DLLs, DLL injection, and, passing hashes, playing around with, handles and pointers, to use a little bit of parlance from the Windows system, to here, the Linux environment, to an angle that we'll touch in a second about even just iOS or Android. So part of that is just, what appeals to you in terms of what do you want to become an expert on? And I think this is kind of an angle that John and I have mentioned in the past too. Become an expert on something. Read the fun RFCs about a particular protocol, or read some of the documentation, or dive into some of the code to understand, what is this function intended to do? What was it supposed to do? Start to think like a developer, and then switch that to start to think like that attacker-minded mentality, which is a bit redundant, just in the sense of, well, they made these assumptions. What if these assumptions go wrong? So it's not intended to be, it's still kind of a high-level answer, but I think one of the first things is kind of finding out what appeals to you in terms of tech stack, be it Windows, Linux, a particular distro, iOS, Android, or even just web, because the diving into the details and the toolkits you need for each of those definitely more than bifurcates, trifurcates, quadruplicates. I'm going to make up a bunch of words. Don't know my Latin well enough here, but there's a lot of paths that you have to follow to go into there.
I think to add on briefly to that, because maybe we'll make this into a future episode of, as usual, listeners, if you want to hear more about this, reach out to us. But, I was thinking there, Akira, is looking at the write-up for the heap overflow. And what I was going to say is, how do you get into the space of becoming a security tester like this, like an AppSec tester? Probably a tester in general, but let's say AppSec. Okay, you have to be familiar enough with these things to understand that this is obviously pretty low level, right? So you have to understand what glibc is. You have to understand that there's this thing in there for sorting. You have to understand that there's been some changes in there, how it actually go about writing the changes or actually testing that. So you have to have the developer experience on that. So maybe if you're interested in something like this, you take a step back. And we often talk negatively about the point and click pen test tools, but really that's a way to start, right? It's you see something like, hey, maybe you just got a new widget. I got a new smart plug. Let's plug that thing in, give it an IP address on my Wi-Fi, and let's start poking at it with one of the scanners. What do I find back? And literally go through the process of, okay, well, I see there's port 80 is open and there's some other port open. Okay, well, what can I do those? Can I figure out what's running on those ports? Can I figure out what version? Did they create something themselves, or did they actually just use some open source library? Oh, they're using the open source library. Does that have any known vulnerabilities? It does. What version are they using? And you start going down this path of sort of digging in and understanding. And even that, what I just sort of rambled through really quickly, it's easier with the point and clicky thing, but you have to understand those pieces exist. So there's some good books out there. I think actually didn't Paul write one of the versions of Hacking Exposed? But so there's some books out there to sort of get you into these things easily, or watching YouTube videos nowadays or whatever else. But I think it's, as Mike was saying, identify an area of interest and then go spend some time on YouTube or blogs or whatever else and sort of figure out podcasts, what tickles your interest and how to take the next steps in that.
And some of those things are, bug bounties are one of the great ways to get into this. Although, admittedly, they tend to be very biased towards web applications. There are bug bounties for, bounty programs for others, especially IoT devices, where you can get into some C and C++ code if you wish. But one of the things I'll point out too, and I'm going to tie this article to another one about libx11, speaking of ancient things, is that even in the qsort function, the researchers point out that it's probably not an exploitable vulnerability here, but it's still a vuln. And it's also kind of interesting that, you have to use it in a non-transitive comparison function, which they also point out is not compliant with POSIX and ISO C standards, which sort of just means that it's very unlikely people are going to be using this type of vulnerable code, but it's still a software quality issue as a bit of a callback with Grant. So something to consider, something to fix that fuzzing would find. And this libx11 example, again, probably not a wealth of systems out there that are really going to be exploitable for this particular bug, especially a bug that's been around for 35 years that these researchers just found. But I wanted to highlight it in the sense of it's in an image parsing. Image formats like audio formats, video formats, they're always gnarly. I'm trying to think of the fun, technical, crufty word about cruft that's in there. And a lot of those parsers tend to be C-based. So you get into a lot of offsets, etc. So even if you don't have libx11, but you are handling user-generated content, it's a great conversations to start about how are we handling this? How are we parsing this? What if there were a problem in the parser that we're using? How can we isolate it from the rest of our network? So that's kind of one of those ways I'd say you can turn something that's perhaps not exploitable or exploitable on a very small area into something that could be more relevant to the developers you're working with today.
And ladies and gentlemen, we now know what type of conversation starters which Mike Kashima uses when he's out at parties. We talk about this being old X11. I was making a comment to a friend over the weekend. Oracle has announced they will be supporting Solaris 11.4 until 2037. So it's not dead yet. Yeah, I saw this. I don't have too much more to add beside the funny haha. I think it's and this is one of the reasons, but I guess seriously, we talk about X11 and like for those who have Linux desktops, like, oh, it's on X, but very few people are actually still running X. And there's multiple reasons for that, right? Like the code base was too crazy because we used to get tons of vulnerabilities like this. More modern programming languages, how do you take advantage of the high power graphics cards, using a framework which allows other applications and libraries to more easily interact with them. And also, as I said, less bugs. So there's a reason sometimes we move on from some of these old things that are out there.
There is. And there is. And this one, like the write-ups from Qualys, are really good for just education. Yeah. So they are well written. So that's the other reason I'm always going to highlight these, and why I get invited to so many parties too. And another thing kind of following along still on Kira's question is that iOS could be one of those areas you dive into. And iOS, for many good reasons, has a pretty significant hardening going on, and you can't just flip the evil bit to turn it into an easy jailbroken device. So obviously, security researchers are still finding critical 0 days, etc., vulnerabilities. iOS is getting patched quite a bit, but they also make their security research device available. And this has been available, I think, for about 3 years now. And I have an article from TechCrunch about just a researcher who was posting pictures because of their device, because pictures are fun. But I also linked to the Apple's platform security guide, which has a section on this device and how it interacts and how it's useful to security researchers, as well as just the platform guide itself is a great way to understand what are the groundings, what was the approach to the design of iOS, and where are some areas that could go wrong. So in that spirit of where do I want to start with, just reading about a system is one good place to start. So a couple ways to try to bring things together for you, Akira.
That's awesome. Thank you. There's something that I actually wanted to bring up. I'm like in a super meta mood today. And we have this really great article from TechCrunch that's like pretty basic on like the iOS and the systems that they use that you can really start out with at the beginning. One thing I want to mention though is that there is huge merit into really biting off other articles like the JFrog one and the Qualys one that have a ton of code, that have a lot of jargon. And what I want to say is that there's a really great specific way of how to digest these articles when you're new, and get something out of it, even if you don't understand all the code and you don't understand all the CVEs and all the really technical stuff. I'm not going to tell you how because we'll be here all night, but I want to recommend a book, and it is called A Mind for Numbers, and it walks you through how to decompose these highly technical topics from being a total beginner to digesting these technical topics so that you can move forward and get better at what you do. So again, A Mind for Numbers, check it out. And all that is to say, I just say that to encourage people that are new to this that, yeah, like reading a TechCrunch article is a great place to start, but sometimes that does not exist. Like there's not going to be a TechCrunch article on Nixlib X11. Like that's just not going to exist. And you're going to have to slog through this hard stuff. So that's my meta analysis. And the TechCrunch article just reminded me of that. So there you go.
You know, a quick
so you
comment
don't
on that.
like right?
Well, really briefly, as a, I don't know, you call me mid-level manager, senior manager, whatever, executive in some companies, I don't read this stuff in detail frequently. I'm sure sometimes our listeners can tell, but often I am able to know enough that I'm able to run with it. But if you think about it and it comes back to one of those, as you progress in your career, Akira, you start off like you have to look at I don't want to say TechCrunch version. You look at the basic version of something, and then you get down in the weeds and you become, really good at like recognizing the code quickly and the algorithms or whatever have you. And at some point, if you go up a management track, you just don't have time to read everything that's coming at you. It's like, how do you scan through this stuff quickly and go like, what are they looking at? And that's, it's a bit of an art, but I mean, yeah, learning how to, A Mind for Numbers helps with that type of thing, but also just like figuring out which you need to pay attention to and which not. So don't forget that aspect.
Totally. Yeah. Like learning how to take what you need very quickly and just throw away the rest.
Yeah. Obviously I try to be transparent when I do this, but sometimes just take that article and say, well, let's actually not talk about the article itself directly, but say, what does the article teach us in terms of a threat model for image parsing? How would we do this with lambdas in our AWS environment so that there's no, file system for it to go get persistence on, things like that. So there are some fun conversations that I think you could have that, these are the types of parties I go to. So that's why it's a fun conversation. One of those things that, speaking of me at parties, BoringSSL. So Fastly is adopting this. And I thought this was interesting, not so much as like, this is what Fastly is doing, but we've been talking about all the variants of OpenSSL. There was the Rust TLS that we actually talked about, John and I, at the kickoff of this year, just re-implementing OpenSSL or TLS stacks. Amazon has their own flavor of TLS, which is just about 6,000 lines of code written in C, which is actually very small. And if you look at BoringSSL, or this article from Fastly, Basically, the lines of code is orders of magnitude different between OpenSSL and what Google basically extruded as the useful bits of OpenSSL to get rid of all these obscure, unsupported, unnecessary architectures to support and just focus on what it needs to do. Obviously, a lot of this came from Heartbleed. Heartbleed was that vuln that launched 1,000 ships of different branches of OpenSSL, et cetera. But I thought this was just an interesting example of that theme of do you refactor, do you rewrite, et cetera, with the caveat here that, as Fastly points out, Google has this open source, but Google just really supports BoringSSL for themselves. You're not going to get clean version numbers, release cadences, release notes, et cetera. It's going to be well documented internally, is in within the code. I mean, it's going to be well written code. But that's a choice to make to adopt Boring. So I'm not sure, John, how this falls into your Kinsella scale of refactoring versus rewriting versus just let the code be.
We've talked about this, not this in particular, but when do you stay with a library like OpenSSL, which supports everything in an insecure way, or do you go to something that's a little tighter and a little more right? It's because I think if you've got Fastly, for those who don't know, fairly large scale content distribution network, right? They're sort of cool with hipsters and the JavaScript kids. But so the point making there is they've got, I'm guessing, thousands of servers around the world that are being accessed by millions of different clients, either browsers or IoT things, or all these different things are coming at them. And what I'm setting up here is, how do you know that a new library is going to support the TLS requirements of everyone that's coming at you in a way that is both secure and hopefully cheaper, right? You're not just going to move to it for hell of it. It has to be like either more efficient, use less CPU, or you can have less servers, or it has to be faster, or it has to be less work on your admins to deploy it or to update it, or all these type of things. So that aspect alone of the porting or the rewrite, quote unquote, is significant. Obviously, they were having enough issues that they decided that this was something worth them going down that path and actually talking about it.
John, that brings up an interesting meta point with Akira, which is who makes these decisions? And moving back to our conversation earlier, like, is this a decision that you would make based on a framework? Is this a decision you make based on risk? Like, how do you decide if you should do these huge rewrites? And I know I keep bringing up 20-minute questions, but
no. For folks who are watching that on video, get to see my reaction. Even at a well-doc. So my answers here will be not related to my current, previous, or future employers. If you think about, very seldom is a management level looking at these type of frameworks. Like, HBR articles and things like that, we'll go and quote it and read those and bring it back into discussions. But if we bring in a consulting firm like Grants, then we'll start talking frameworks. But usually internally, that's not happening at a senior level. There'll be something to some degree, but and we might have like risk scores. But for something like this, usually where it's going to come from is chatting with a one-on-one with like one of your principal engineers or something. And they're like, we've been thinking over coffee or lunch that maybe we could think about replacing this library. And at that point, it maybe thought gets in the back of the head. And then at some point in the future, it's like, well, we were looking for a way to stop getting on the front page or having to, because the other aspect of cost I didn't cover is when there's a new vulnerability out in OpenSSL, that's something you have to patch. But unlike doing an upgrade on the next version of release, this is something we have to do now, especially on a CDN, right? So it's like, how can I, probably the question when this would come up of like, how can I remove that pain point of, I've got this vulnerable library, which is keep being vulnerable. They have to keep having my ops stop everything else they're doing and go and update it to deal with that instead. So that's sort of the thought process. It's not so much, do we want to go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add there is that the question comes up, how much of a liability is OpenSSL, or how much of a liability is fill in the blank, in the sense of we've had a heartbleed level type of issue. It's a scramble. This is pervasive in our network. It's external facing, basically a risk-oriented discussion that says, well, would our lives be easier if we did something else? And as John pointed out, it's probably that security engineer, security architect, just type of discussions that are like, think of it as the SRE. What helps us make the platform more stable? What helps us make the platform more observable? What just makes our pagers go off less often at night because we don't want to have to deal with a lot of vulns? And getting rid of and doing something like looking at OpenSSL, looking at his age, and just there was a lot of extraneous support in there is something to consider. I guess the only other thing I'd add to that is we're starting to touch on that sort of secure by design theme that I keep trying to bring up. TLS 1.3 is another, regardless of OpenSSL, TLS 1.3 helps just narrow down the number of cipher suites, number of options that just need to be done within that TLS hello handshake. And so that already is, rather than figure out, oh, are you using this weird old hashing or this old version of RSA? It's just, these are known secure. You have a choice of a few known secure. Just use those. So nudging everyone to TLS 1.3 is another way to have that discussion at Kira, rather than talk about OpenSSL versus boring versus something else.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Speaking of secure design, I have an article from CISA about a secure by design alert that I'll come to in a second. But sometimes, John, authentication is optional in our designs. Is this a good thing?
I would say for most cases, no. In this particular case, definitely no. So Mr. Shima is hinting at an article which I shared from Watchtower Labs. Did some research and found a ODE in Juniper's. I'm telling you, I didn't even actually double check which Juniper devices they are. Some of their routers, I believe. But it must be a security switch since they said that. So anyways, they opened this article with a line of, oh, come on, John. Don't have my quotes ready. It's, please remember that we are discussing an appliance from a security vendor and thus have to expect the security bar to be lower. But anyways, on Juniper gears, which is running some Juniper gear, which is running PHP web interfaces. We know where I'm going already. I mean, what are these guys? I would love, talk about, the one story real quickly. Obviously, hot point for me. We talk about rewriting things in Rust or rewriting things in different language. Please God, when are they going to stop using PHP? Anyways, Juniper, or excuse me, Watchtower was poking around this Juniper device and realized that, no authentication on some of the endpoints, our API endpoints. Okay, by itself, not the end of the world. Maybe it's just get information or something like that. And they went a little further and poked a little more and realized that they were able to access some files on the system, including being able to capture a copy of the encrypted root password for the box, which means you take it over to your cracker and some period of time later, you've got that password decrypted and you're now able to access this device over SSH or web interface or what have you. So that's the vulnerability. PHP, they'll fix it. But then the second aspect for our listeners to think about, apparently for whatever reason, Juniper is on a quarterly release pattern. So the second Wednesday of the first month of every quarter is when Juniper releases their security updates. I'm sure they do some out of band in some cases, but it seems like in 2024, we should be expecting a little more of our vendors or even ourselves, right? Not just our vendors. And it's that question to ask yourself, like, if we have something significant in the morning, how quickly can we figure out what's going on, patch it, test it, release it, inform our customers, everything that we need to do?
I wanted to use that to maybe tie it into this secure by design alert, because this one talks about Soho devices, and I don't know that Juniper's running in any home offices, although John has quite a pretty awesome set of gear around. So maybe he's with the one exception. But in this alert from CISA, I think this is their third one so far. It does have under their it links to a PDF, which has a principle 1, take ownership of customer security outcomes. And it has 4 bullet points in there that do seem actionable. Things like have some automated updates, which is helpful here. Have them not have to wait every quarter, at least, have them timely. Let's use that. Putting the web management interface on LAN side ports, that seems reasonable. Don't expose it to the internet. And if it does have to be exposed to the internet, have something secure. I think I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I feel about these secure by design alerts. They do seem to be like good lessons learned in the sense of, look how bad things have been. But we probably have at least 2, if not 3 decades worth of look how bad things have been. And I worry about turning, the top 10 CISA secure by design alerts from 2024, follow them, and just becomes a list as opposed to things that are actionable. And I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but we see the secure by design, and I'm really just hoping we see what would be great that's actually useful for developers to receive from this. What guidance would we like to see?
Mike, I agree with you. One thing I did at Resilia is I made like a flow chart essentially of like, if you get X flag from Sneak, then you do Y. Or if you get X issues from your threat model, then you do Y. And I would like to also see a bridge. I like that they have some concrete steps in this article, but I would like to know like what activities specifically, not like ideas and meta things. So we're going to step back from that, but like what actual AppSec or product security or whatever, what activities do you do then? What does this lead to?
Well,
So I'd be curious.
And part of this is trying to get away from that idea of chasing bugs. So, for example, this is a reaction to hard-coded credentials, et cetera. But rather than saying don't hard-code credentials, it's trying to figure out what is the design that led us to that in the first place. What are the better design patterns to follow for remote administration of the device? Or how do we handle remote updating so that users, it happens mostly transparently, but also doesn't brick the device, because updates are, they especially for small organizations, they can be time wasters, time takers, time investments, and other synonyms.
I want to say one last thing, and that is, again, that I completely agree. And I think that this mindset does get us too much into chasing bugs. If you are just doing the activities that you need to do secure by design, I think that's more important to focus on than getting stuck in like, oh no, like this thing got flagged, right? Because otherwise we're just putting more issues on the developers without actually empowering them to take action toward the very beginning of their development time.
Or perhaps, to use Grant's parlance with the product security framework, improving our understanding. What is our understanding of the underlying issue? And are we working on something that addresses a class of vulns or just this one particular instance? Kind of on that theme, I'll just leave us real quick with a article that's purely developer driven from Josh Goldberg. He is someone who has been on the show twice last year. We were talking about presentations, and he's and a developer's perspective of AppSec. So he's one of those good references we want to hear more from on the developer side of things. And he has a blog that's really just talking about a prettier versus a linter, and do you run them this together? Do you run them differently? And rather than dive into such a VI versus Emacs or that type of discussion, I did want to point it out in the sense of maybe plant that seed of conversation. Do we have a developer's security plugin for their IDE that does all the things, or that just does one thing well, running a SAST or an SCA, or looking for looking for one particular type of design pattern that's wrong? And I don't really have an answer for this, and that's also why I saved it to the end, so that we have our get out free by saying, oh, we're just about out of time. But if we were to leave our listeners with some thoughts on this topic about what should go into that developer toolbox or their IDE, I don't know, Kira and then John, do you have a short list of maybe one or two things, or how you'd react to this?
I wouldn't say one or two things because I don't want to guide people toward making decisions that aren't good for their organization. What I would focus on is what areas of risk do you want the developers to focus on, and not like where is important? Are we doing all of them, right? Like, where are we really focusing on in this moment?
Yes.
And don't give the developers 1,000 freaking alerts when they're writing code. Make it really lightweight. That's what I would say.
How do you want to take us out, John?
Going to go in a different direction. I don't think I care about if you have security alerts in your IDE or not. I'd leave that to each individual developer. What I would like to see, I was thinking about this, so prettiers or these type of things, where I want them actually is I want to set a standard for a development team so that I don't have two or more different forms of formatting going into the code, because then when you go look at your diffs, you're like half your diff issues are white space. One of the beautiful things about Go. So yeah, anything else? No. I mean, yeah, there's so many tools out there. I'm not going to tell people what to use. We've all got ours. Depends on which system you're using. What you use in Vim versus what you use in Emacs versus VS Code. Yeah, versus Microsoft Word. Let's not forget people code.
Oh, for sure.
That's what I'm going to go out on.
But I think it's a good point to go out on, and I'll highlight the aspect of the reason we're having this conversation, that people actually have to read the code. And I think that's the part that if people can read code, hopefully they will find more quickly those vulns in syslog qsort, or you more easily find those 35-year-old vulns in libx 11, because it looks like the tools are in fact falling short to a degree. But we also are falling short of our time allocated for this news segment. So therefore, thank you, Akira. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us. Please do subscribe, share us on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of secure design, check out Data Breach from Teradyne. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.